Coming up on the Sky News Daily, inside Syria after Assad. How are people feeling and what's been uncovered? We'll be with our correspondent in Damascus. After more than a decade of civil war and half a century of rule under the Assad family, the Syrian people are waking up each morning to a new, different reality. The sound in the sky has been dominated by celebratory gunfire, as well as the booms of airstrikes. Israel says it is taking out military targets, which it says could fall into the wrong hands. But what about on the ground? Amongst the cries of elation, what are Syrians feeling about the future of their country? And with its prisons opening up, what further horrors of its recent past are being uncovered? I'm Darren McCaffrey, and this time on The Daily, we're asking, what do the Syrian people want? Stuart Ramsay is Sky News' chief correspondent in Damascus. Stuart, the city's just been liberated in the last couple of days. How are people feeling?
Well, there's a certain amount of jubilation still, and certainly as you get into the night time, you get a lot of soldiers out on the street and civilians as well, but a lot of soldiers firing into the air just literally thousands upon thousands of rounds. In the suburbs, there are shops that have opened and people are wandering the streets and are chatting on street corners. You see a lot of that. So generally speaking, a relieved city that appears to have perhaps got away without the major fighting everyone expected to take place. The people who are out celebrating, I've spoken to lots of people out on the street, of course, are being very positive about everything. They're optimistic. They're pleased that the Assad regime has fallen. So you've got this sort of calm, people saying, wow, this revolution has happened, happy when they're out celebrating, etc. But there is a tension, there's no doubt about it, not least because there's so many men with guns wandering around or in jeeps, etc., everywhere you go. And they're being perfectly friendly. But there is always a sort of a menacing air to that when you see this type of thing. I think the apprehension is what happens next. The country was already massively divided, and that has changed in as much as the regime has gone. But there are many other forces around the whole of the country, not all of whom get on. So there is that concern as well. There's the concern about the shape of the government and what it will be like. Will it become an Islamic republic, but also a sort of a militant one? Or will it be a liberal one, which so far the revolutionary leadership seem to be inferring it will be the position they take?
Stuart, you've spent a lot of time in countries that have been through an awful lot of upheaval. I have not. I've never lived in a country effectively with no government, no functioning civil service, no police force. What is today like in Damascus for ordinary people? If a crime happens, is there any police force to report it to? Does life function at all in any way that other people in the Western world would find relatable?
No, it is functioning in as much as, I would say very immediately that there is a lack of supplies. There's a lack of petrol already, and that's going to continue and get worse as the days go by, because there's not supplies coming in. So they'll start running out seriously of all sorts of basics that they need, because there just won't be the supply routes in and open for people to bring it in. So they will go through their stocks relatively quickly, I think. There are no police, but the fighters are on the street. And so if there was to be a crime, you'd probably find it would be dealt with fairly quickly with pretty harsh justice by those forces. Now, I've seen this in many, many countries. Interestingly, in that chaos that is caused by a government being overthrown, the civil service stopping working, the police disappearing off the streets, actually, the fighters themselves usually bring about a fair amount of calm. There were curfews here. There's a curfew takes place. It's not immediately observed. It's from about 5:00 in the evening, I think. But most people are out still. But by sort of mid-evening, the soldiers are actually making sure that people stay inside. And I think you'd be wise to do so. It's not complete lawlessness. You're not seeing people looting, because, as I say, they would probably be shot dead on the spot. And I think many people are so tired of the way the previous regime operated, the arrests of people for often for nothing, or being associated to people who were in opposition to them or were protesters, that they actually had enough of it all. So I think they're hoping that this is the start, a difficult start maybe, but the start of a new period whereby just the Assad family name and all the horrors that came with it have moved on. I think that's what they're pinning their hopes on, for sure.
What then, though, Stuart, of those, and in every brutal dictatorship, there is always a section of society that provides supports, that fought on behalf of Assad. What about them? They must be now fearful about their futures, about retribution.
Well, yeah, the retribution question is a big one. Now, the fighting group has said itself that they're not interested in retribution against people who were conscripts, for example, or if they worked for the government. Traffic cops are probably all right. Police, probably not. Many of them will be very fearful. Many will have got across the border as soon as they could. But there will be, I'm sure about it, some soldiers who are still here. And of course, that does add to the tension and the danger. It's like, have those forces all completely gone away, or is there potential for some of them to regroup? The impression I'm getting at the moment is no, they don't seem to be wanting to regroup. And the current administration that's here and the Prime Minister have all talked about a handover of power. It appears that it was a very fast moving and incredibly successful revolution, if you like. The ultimate worst case scenario is Islamic State repositions itself and rises up again. They took away the original People's Revolution back in 2011 and beyond and basically stymied it completely. They've since been not destroyed, but damaged to the point that they can't influence things. The big fear here is, of course, and actually for the international community, is that they regroup and reestablish themselves. And then Syria could be a much different place again.
Stuart, one of the things that you've been doing is going out and about talking to people, but also going to places like hospitals where people are trying to find not sometimes their loved ones alive, but just to find a body, their body.
Yeah, that is an incredibly large and significant part of all life here at the moment. Is everyone knows somebody, it seems, whose loved one was disappeared, many of whom they know were killed. Now, we were with people today. In fact, we had word that a number of bodies had been taken to a hospital and were being held in a morgue. And those bodies had come from, I'm not sure how many, but a few of the detention centres. But they'd been brought there for experts to try to begin the identification process. Now, word spread very quickly that that was going to happen. And so we arrived to large numbers of people, pretty chaotic, people clutching photographs of their loved ones, usually young men, a lot of tears and a lot of questions like, are they here? Are the bodies that we can see in body bags ours? And this regime is responsible for just so many deaths of people in custody and the rounding up of huge numbers of people on a sort of a weekly basis. They were killing huge numbers. So it was a machine designed to keep the power of the regime in place. And by doing that, you arrested anyone they could get their hands on who was the opposition. They would torture them incessantly, and more often than not, they died. And so what we have seen is people being released from prison who have been being held. I was talking to a young man today. He couldn't get up off the floor because he's been held in a position kneeling down for so long, his legs won't unfurl anymore. And I think it's this sort of callous disregard for basic human decency is what Bashar al Assad will one day have to answer for, because it's not just being in power. It's not just maintaining that power. It was the way that they did it, which was basically to kill anyone who opposed them. Now, dictatorial regimes around the world have a tendency to do this. We know that. It's just the volume of people that seems to be the case. Going back, by the way, not just Bashar, but his father as well. They've always done it. And for such a very long time, this has been a dictatorship, a tyrannical one, but ultimately an extremely evil and cruel one as well.
Hayat al-Sham, the rebel group that led to the ousting of the Assad regime, they're still a banned terrorist group by the UK and others over their links to al-Qaeda in the past. Question is, have they changed? Do the people of Damascus think they've changed? And are women more apprehensive?
No, well, actually, funny enough, not particularly. So you have, and I think it's an age group thing. I just quickly say, I think they're hoping that they've changed. And remember, actually, ISIS did actually fight with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And the membership was purged of those very far extreme views, as if they'd been positioning themselves for this very day. But the older generation, I think, are just tired out and are actually just thinking, perhaps we can move on. Bear in mind, and you mustn't forget, the economy is absolutely tanked. There is nothing. Nothing's been good here for a lot of people throughout the country for a very, very long time. So any change is widely going to be seen as a good thing. I was interested, though, by the young women we spoke to who seemed absolutely convinced that there was going to be change. And given that, as they were talking to me with Islamist fighters, essentially, with just looking like my daughter, to be honest, dressed like my daughter, not with any type of covering, and nobody was blinking an eyelid, would suggest, for now at least, that is the path that this new government wants to take. The problem is if it breaks down and they have to revert to a type which allows them to impose their own form of control, different, but basically on the same principle of Bashar al Assad, which was to control the will of the people by force if necessary. They're saying that's not going to happen, but in Syria, you just don't know that it won't.
The word that you and I have talked about a lot this interview is hope. I read today from a Syrian writer saying that Syria has always been condemned to hope. There was hope in 2000 when Bashar al-Assad took over that he might be different from his father. There was hope in 2011 during the uprising that things would change. And yet at every turn, almost things have got worse, if you like. You've been to Syria many times. Do you think there is a different type of hope? Are you more hopeful about the future of Syria?
I'm hopeful in as much as that the end of a very bad regime appears certain. I'm hopeful in that some of the fighters that I was talking to, some from Homs, which is a place I went to right at the beginning of all of this, and they've been fighting ever since. And they were talking very much in proper organised country where all religions are tolerated and that everyone can work. So they're making all the right noises at this stage. I just say it's so early on. There's so many factions involved here. There's been so many countries involved in the fighting, and in many ways it was once described as this is almost exactly the same as World War I, because countries from all over the world were in some shape or form involved in the fighting by supporting one side or the other. Now that support may have gone down, but it's still basically there. So it's a matter of, is it possible for Syria to find a space within itself where it can actually legitimately create a government, talk about having elections and actually moving forward? One can hope that that's the case, but we're, I'd say, quite a long way from that. It's too early.
Stuart Ramsay in Damascus, thank you very much for your time and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be keeping an eye on events in Syria here on The Daily. And for the very latest, head to skynews.com or indeed the app. We'll be back tomorrow.